Hi everyone. Thank you everybody for being here. We are having a little problem with the sharing of the screen of our guest. So, well, I think what is better is maybe we take a small break, so we have like time to fix that problem with the authorization to sharing the screen. So there is like some software problem in this case. So, but we are here today for one more lecture of the Permanent Forum, Project Cities and the Processes. The lecture of today, it's going to be from Professor Douglas Spencer, and it's about the dialectic of nature and capital, subjects of the eco-imaginary. So we will go out a little bit again, so we can try to fix that problem. And let's make an appointment so we can come back here in at 6:30. So we have the time to figure out the problem, solve it, and come back. So please, I will also just so I can also make the some informs about the forum before we take this break. Just put here. So the forum this year is a little bit different than the other years. We have we had already 3 different lectures, and we have also in the next week we're gonna have 2 more lectures, one on Wednesday and the other one on Friday too. So the next lecture is going to be about regional design, a transformative approach to planning, and it's from a lecture from Professor Valeria Lingua, and she will be speaking about the work on her lab that's also called regional design, and after that, on Friday, we will have the last lecture of this year. That's going to be about landscape design methods, experimentation along rivers with Professor Angioleta Vogueira from Politecnico of Turin. So we will go out a little bit and come back. This is the lecture of the next Friday, and the lecture of next Wednesday is going to be about regional design. So we're going to go out a little bit, and we wait to try to fix this problem. So please, you can interrupt and let's make a break so we can try to figure out that. Okay, I think we fixed the problem. So let's start. Finally, we can start the our presentation. So thank you everybody for watching us now, and those who are watching live, and also those ones who will be watching later the video record. We are here today for one more lecture of the Permanent Forum Project Processes, City and Processes. I am Camilo Amaral, professor at the Federal University of Goiás, and I will be the chair of this session. Today we are here for the lecture of Douglas Spencer. We have an expectation of 1 hour for the lecture. It is entitled Dialectic of Nature and Capital, Subjects of the Eco-Imaginário. And at the end of the lecture, we're going to have a questions and answer session. So please share your comments and questions on the live chats of Facebook or YouTube, and we will collect them to make the questions after the lecture. Please identify yourself or your institution and the city so we can have a reference on that. And for those who want a certificate for attending this live lecture, you can find the link of the Google form in the chat. We're going to post that there. So this initiative of this forum is from the post-graduation program Project and City and the Project Processes Labs in a partnership with the Journal Jatobá. The forum had different formats before, but this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemics, we went virtual and global, so exploring somehow this difficult situation in a way to expand this discussion. But for that matter, we should share solidarities with the families that are affected by the COVID, and also the words of encouragement for those who are taking care of the sick. And the idea of this forum is to discuss the different processes of project and analyzing the city, but also to think about the city itself as a social process. So it focuses on critical ways of thinking the city and the possible and impossible ways to change it. Considering the complex challenges we are facing today and all these crises we are living now, beyond the latest sanitary crisis, we have an economic crisis, a political crisis, a humanitarian crisis, ecological crisis that maybe is very close to the discussion today. But this discussion also may open a discussion about a crisis of rational thinking and a crisis of modernity, a crisis of the subjectivity that we are producing under neoliberal capitalism. So now I would like to gladly welcome Professor Douglas Spencer, who will be speaking for us virtually from Des Moines in USA, which literally means the monks. So it's a historical place of spiritual reflection, maybe. And but actually, Douglas has a paper on monastery thinking about architecture and a critique of that. So maybe it's very, very precise. Thank you very much for accepting to share your research with us, and a research that is building a very solid critical theoretical reasoning, and one that I learned it is done in a radical framework of thinking philosophy, which once you taught me, it's a way to seek for the roots of the problem, not just the surface of those problems. So there is a very deep theoretical reflection in all of Douglas Spencer work. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Douglas Spencer is currently the director of graduate education and a Picard Chilton professor in the Iowa State University in the Department of Architecture. He has previously taught in the Architectural Association, the Royal College of Arts, and the University of Westminster, both in post-graduation courses, supervising PhDs, and also teaching at different levels. He has delivered keynote and guest lectures internationally, and contributed for many essays and publications, include the Log, the Journal of Architecture, Radical Philosophy, Architectural Design, Efflux, and many others, New Geographies. He has also contributed with chapters for collections such as Architectural Affects After Deleuze and Guattari, Architecture and Feminism, also from Routledge in 2017, Landscape and Agency from Routledge, and this thing called the Theory from Routledge, and also very interesting book, Architecture Against the Post-Political, which is, we can say, is pretty much about his research, how to repoliticize the discussion in architecture. His book, The Architecture of Neoliberalism, has become a critically acclaimed work and widely cited, and it's now a standard point of reference in the analysis of contemporary architecture and also neoliberal capitalism. His new book, it's a very new book, it's called The Critique of Architecture, brand new book, Essays on Theory, Autonomy, and Political Economy, has just been published by Birkhaus, Bauwelt, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correct, Bauwelt Fundamente, the editors. This book offers a new, renewed and radical theorization of the relations between capital and architecture. So I think it's a very important discussion to bring today when we are thinking about architecture. And his lecture today is somehow in reference of this new research, new book, and he will kindly relate it to a series of concerns that involves also the forum and tying together different parts of this book. You can follow his work and the news from what is happening in the critical theory field in his Twitter. So if you can put his Twitter here, is a very good way to know what's happening in the critical theory field of discussion. So I'm really glad that you accepted to talk to us. I'm really amazed about your work, and I with no more delays, I will please ask you to fill a comma and deliver your lecture for us. Thank you for coming, Douglas.
Okay, thank you very much, Camilo. So can you hear me, firstly?
Yes, it's all fine now, I think.
Okay. That's great. So what I don't have on my CV is being skilled at working with computer applications, and the mea culpa for that. But thanks very much, Camilo, for this invitation. And thanks very much to the people working backstage so that we could actually make this work. So I'm just going to get straight into this lecture, Dialectic of Nature and Capital, Subjects of the Eco-Imaginary. And I'm going to begin with reference to a report of 2019 that appears on the website greenroofs.com on a project for environmental improvement for Singapore. By quoting from that, whilst I play soundlessly the video that accompanies this report on the presentation. So we have in this report a journalist for Property Guru who writes, the Building and Construction Authority, this is in Singapore, hopes 80% of buildings will be Green Mark certified by 2030, way above the 20% in 2013. Green walls, he continues, in Singapore are not only popping up in hotels, shopping malls and stores. They have also been incorporated into residential developments. In fact, a condominium by property giant City Developments Limited has been cited by the Guinness World Records as having the biggest green wall in the world, reported by Nikkei Asian Review. The article continues. Singapore government has set up a framework called, appropriately enough, LUSH, L-U-S-H, which is the acronym for landscaping for urban spaces and high-rises, to encourage developers and architects to include greenery in their designs. Government policy has helped drive the green wall boom in Singapore. The article continues. Former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew underscored that transforming Singapore into a garden city would provide it a competitive edge over other regional hubs following its independence in 1965. The government is even willing to pay up to half the cost of rooftop gardens and walls. So I think that's an appropriate way to start a lecture, at least I hope it is, given Camilo's introduction to the larger context of the series overall and to the issues of the city and the processes of capitalist development that are currently underway in this, given that Singapore is in fact a city state. So it presents quite an interesting case in regard of that. Now, the reason I'm starting with this report set in Singapore, the reason I'm starting with something which is a kind of ordinance or set of protocols for greening the city is because this sort of project precisely elicits a response that offers a criticism of capitalist greenwashing, that offers a would-be critique whose point of reference is the fact that capitalism, big business are focused only on appropriating the environmental crisis for commercial uses, or to somehow conceal the real work of capitalism, the real work of money-making, accumulation, and so forth, through this kind of environmental disguise. But I feel that this critique is in itself somewhat superficial, and that in fact the relationship between capital and nature is, as the title of my lecture suggests, much more dialectical, so much more dynamically interrelated than this. It's much more deep-seated. It has a much greater historical longevity that goes back at least to the 18th century. And that we're looking at something other than simply a process of greenwashing, because the relationship between nature and capital is essential to capitalism. It's not something it just imports from outside at this particular moment in order to present itself in a certain reputable guise. There is something much more fundamental here. And as I write in the abstract for this talk, capital progressively subjects everything in nature to its own apparatus of accumulation. At the same time, it has still to posit nature as its outside in order to stage and restage the performance of its own mystery play, the struggle in which this nature is subdued, conquered, and colonized, the ongoing performance through which capitalism naturalizes its own history and its own version of the human, the entrepreneurial, innovative, and ever-resourceful figure of Homo economicus. Nature, thus naturalized, is then reimagined as an aesthetic resource, repurposed as a platform for a romanticized harmonization of man and nature. Now, this dialectic of nature and capital is, in some sense, and as I hope to show through the lecture, unchanging, inevitably caught in and condemned to endlessly play out and perform its own contradictions. Yet, impelled by the existential threat of environmental crisis it now faces, the techno-utopianism to which much contemporary architecture and urban design is attached presents this dialectic in an especially exasperated form. And this is what I call the eco-imaginary of capital. Not only is this dialectic exasperated, but the form through which it appears is exasperated too. And when I use the term exasperated, and especially the term exasperated form, I'm drawing on the work of Manfredo Tafuri, especially his quite well-known essay, for those who know Tafuri, and the kind of radical history and theory of architecture. His essay of 1969 called Towards a Critique of Architectural Ideology. In a section of that essay, headed Form as Regressive Utopia, he writes, from the very beginnings, the architecture of the Enlightenment had already managed to formulate one of the principles that the path of contemporary art would follow: the disarticulation of form and the inorganic nature of structure. And it's not insignificant, he writes, that the perception of these new formal values was linked from the start to the problem of the new city that was soon to become the institutional site of modern bourgeois society. When looking at a piece of Victorian architecture, he writes, we are struck by the exasperation of the object there before us. We rarely take into consideration that eclecticism and linguistic pluralism for 19th century architects represented the proper response to the multiple disruptive stimuli produced by the new environment that technology's universe of precision had created. So this is an essential point, and I hope to show how this is the disarticulation that he's talking about recurs, and we still have it. We might immediately think of the imagery promotional video of this somewhat kind of awkward relationship between the structure and the organic, that they come together through a kind of collage form. But Tafuri is talking here in reference to Victorian architecture about the disarticulation of form and the inorganic nature of structure, which I hope, at least I think, that this drawing and section of Tower Bridge starts to introduce us, at least, in that, you know, famously it's well, who knows what it is? It's Victorian, so it's a kind of eclectic mishmash, but it's, you know, in some sense, perhaps a kind of, it's got elements of Gothic revivalism within it, among other things. It kind of looks like a, you know, perhaps a castle or a palace, but the the structure, the technology is, for its time, absolutely modern. And those things are disarticulated from one another. But Tafuri is talking about this as kind of an exasperation of form, of trying to get form and older ideas about form to do something in relation to conditions and historical conditions and circumstances which are entirely alien to their origins. And his other, perhaps more well-known example is that of German expressionist architecture as it appears and is deployed in the modern metropolis. So, for example, in the case of Berlin, in the Großschaft Spielhaus by Hans Polzig here, or of Eric Mendelssohn's department stores, for example, in Stuttgart, where these are, for Tafuri, the opposite side of the coin from the architecture of a Mies van der Rohe or a Ludwig Hilberseimer, those latter pair being representative of a rational, objective accommodation of architecture to a rational and objective society, whereas the expressionist architects are trying to work with form to respond to the stimuli and the dynamics of the modern metropolis. So in any case, these are examples of exasperated form being really kind of pushed to its limits to try and address particular conditions. And I think that we might begin to take more seriously the attempts of contemporary architects and the contemporary city to dress itself in ecological guise as examples of exasperated form. I want also just to give a quick kind of verbal footnote to this, which is that this essay by Tafuri is called Critique of Ideology. Ideology here is not something that one strips away in order to get to the truth of things. Ideology might be an illusion, but in the words of Adorno, it's a necessary illusion. So it's kind of structurally necessary part of the fabric of the city in this case. In the case of the developments in Singapore, for example, of green walls and green roofs adorning the entire city, that is also the kind of necessary illusion of a response to environmental crisis. Now, if we just delve a bit further back, or substantially further back, I'm going to talk for a few moments about Robinson, or perhaps longer than that, in fact, be prepared for longer than that, about Robinson Crusoe and the myth of Robinson Crusoe and the role that this plays in the thought of Marx. Marx's point in referencing Robinson Crusoe, which he does in Capital, is to point out that the political economists, remember that Capital is not a work of political economy, it's a critique of political economy, that the political economists he's critiquing have a kind of illusionistic notion of who we are as human beings and what our capacities are. And this is represented for him by the Robinson Crusoe story. So following on from that, I think that what we see in a lot of the representations of environments renewed, revived by environmental greening is the form of the eco-imaginary of capitalism, but often its ideal form is like that of Robinson Crusoe, is that of the island, and I will get to that in the examples of the Bjarke Ingels group project Oceanics a little later. But I think it's on these sites that the eco-imaginary can play out in contemporary fashion long-standing fantasies of individual autonomy, tales of free economic subjects recreating civil society through their own individual ingenuity. So Robinson Crusoe, as Marx observed, is the archetype of this fantasy. Daniel Defoe's protagonist, shipwrecked and returned to a state of nature, proceeds to reproduce in microcosm the bourgeois life world of his own era. So it's as if whenever this happened, wherever this happened, this is, if you took a human being away from civilization, somehow what they would reproduce is 18th, 19th century bourgeois society, almost as a kind of natural way of engaging with the environment. So that's in itself a process of naturalizing the relationship between the subject and nature. So with this figure of Robinson, as we can see on the slide you're currently looking at, so he manages to salvage some commodities from the shipwreck. Other things, other items of equipment are fashioned from what he finds to hand in his environment, which is now in turn grasped as a resource to be worked over, to be made instrumental. And from his encounters with the indigenous population, he takes a servant, teaches him to speak English, and converts him to Christianity, all the while keeping an account of everything, recording income and expenditure in his ledger. So for Marx, Robinson Crusoe is emblematic of the fantastical form through which capitalism imagines itself as both a product of and a guarantor of individual, the individual autonomous subject. He points out that rather than loosening the bonds of feudalism so as to free the individual from social ties, capitalism is in fact founded on the intensification of forms of social interdependence, including those of labour, trade, and communication. But these relationships, these intensely social but economically mediated relationships, they have to remain obscure so that its fantasies of possessive individualism can be maintained. As Marx writes in the Grundrisse, the epoch which produces this standpoint, that of the social individual, is also precisely that of the hitherto most developed social, from this standpoint, general relations. The standpoint of the individual is for Marx an effect of capitalism rather than the source of its achievements. This is worth emphasizing because I think it's a difficult idea because it goes against common sense to say that the individual is not an a priori given, that the individual is produced through societal relations. The human being, he continues, is in the most literal sense a zoon politikon, or a political animal, not merely a gregarious animal, he writes, but an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society. Production by an isolated individual outside society is as much of an absurdity as the development of language without individuals living together and talking to each other. So I think the situation that we have now is one where capitalism is pressed to append and incorporate this currently ongoing, unfolding ecological crisis into its existing and foundational fantasies, the Robinson Crusoe myth. It does so, however, without being able to alter the terms of its imaginary. Its imaginary is one in which individuals occupy the center of the picture, with the relations of interdependence pushed out of sight, beyond its frame of reference. Hence, the exasperated form in which the eco-imaginary of capitalism currently appears. Yeah, so this is a necessary illusion that we're presented with, that the dialectic I'm addressing is that capital has to continually take into its own body all of nature, you know, including not just green spaces, but all the kind of all biology, all species, including humans, and make them work within its own logic, use them as sources of value, use those as sources of accumulation, of valorization. And yet it also has to, in a kind of aesthetic, ideological register, it always has to kind of show us nature as being outside, because it has to keep restaging this story about how through conquering nature, taming it, exercising our own skills of cunning and risk-taking and entrepreneurial engagement, we create ourselves as those human individuals. So I think that Marx really stresses in these quotations that you can still see on the, up here, the fallacy of the free individual autonomous entrepreneurial subject. But I also want to emphasize that the way in which this subject engages with nature necessarily to produce themselves is also a critical part of this dialectic. And in fact, in Capital, I mean, Marx only, properly speaking, talks about the history of capitalism much later in the book. In the first volume, I think it's chapter 27, where he's writing about primitive accumulation. And he's talking there about the process whereby people who lived more or less directly from the land are moved on from that land so that it can then be turned over to forms of more intensive capitalist agricultural production, and to things like sheep grazing in place of that, and that the workers are then more or less forced into in England and Scotland at least, are kind of forced into the newly industrializing cities and have to sell their labor. And so that kind of conquest of nature is part of the dialectic where workers are produced as workers who cannot directly engage with the land but have to sell their labor, get money for that, and then use that money to buy food. Right, but the other part of it, the other side of this is this process which kind of goes on, is ongoing, but is kind of growing in intensity through the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. It's also the same period where the category of landscape as a Western aesthetic category appears. So that nature has this dual purpose, one as a source of extraction, not only in England, but in the plantations of the colonies of the New World and of Africa. But on the other hand, is kind of returns to at least some as an aesthetic resource. So there's this kind of return of nature. It kind of lives on as a more or less private aesthetic enjoyment. Now this story, this relationship between nature and humanity as represented, or as Sylvia Wynter would say, overrepresented by the white Western entrepreneurial subject, that keeps being played out. But with the logic of capital, that's also about expanding its own horizons of, you know, there is this kind of expansionist logic of capitalism towards growth, that it, you know, it can't reach an equilibrium, or else it stagnates. I mean, arguably it is stagnating, but this is what it's trying to ward off by always trying to find new frontiers. And at the same time, those frontiers provide this image of an outside nature that will then be captured, you know, tamed, colonized, over and over again. And we can see this in many expressions of popular culture. I think the film The Martian by Ridley Scott is an interesting example of this. So, yeah, if you haven't seen the film, guy gets left behind. It's, you know, it's a shipwreck in space. He gets left behind to fend for himself. So through his ingenuity, he manages to kind of make Mars bloom. And there's a very interesting, from our perspective, in terms of this discussion, a very interesting point in the film where he's growing his crops, and we see him, or we hear him speaking to his diary that he's recording his experience in, and say, apparently, if you grow crops on a place, then you own it. Hey, I colonized Mars. So we see a pretty perfect example of how the logic of expansion and colonization and conquest by an individual is replayed here. And this notion of kind of you know, reaching out, having perhaps exhausted, if not nature itself, then it exhausted the possibilities for growth. This notion of kind of reaching out to, you know, other planets, reaching out into space. That, for instance, especially actually Fred Sharman writes about very interestingly, is also exemplary of this. So we have here this rendering of a space colony by Rick Giudice for NASA in the 1970s. And as Fred Sharman has also pointed out, our more recent representations of this techno-pastoral colonization also strikingly resemble those of 50 years back, those that are presented to us perhaps first through the NASA space program in the 60s and 70s. And this is an image from Jeff Bezos' Blue Ocean program or project. I was talking in another recent lecture about how we personify capital, and about how more and more everyone is kind of compelled to not necessarily believe in capitalism, but to perform as if one did. There's kind of no escape from it. It's, you know, that's kind of reference to what Michel Foucault says in the late 70s about how we are all compelled to be entrepreneurs of ourselves. And I think that's true, but I also think that the other side of that, if you like, is that we have huge, I think probably unprecedented concentrations of wealth wealth in terms of capital in the hands of a tiny number of people who then, like Jeff Bezos, to a lesser degree Elon Musk, who then become kind of like a hypertrophic form of the entrepreneurial subject. So this is Jeff Bezos's Blue Moon project. Blue Origin project. So if we look at an image like this and just take a little time just to reflect on this kind of unconvincing attempts to relate structure to form, then I think we're looking at something which is, I would say, it's another example of exasperated form, in that, in some sense, this is not, it's certainly more dramatic than Tower Bridge, but there's the same kind of logic in it still, a wish to keep hold of something familiar while using something absolutely advanced to produce that. I mean, I think, perhaps it kind of speaks of the poverty of the eco-imaginary, because it imagines kind of us venturing into space in huge spaceships, but the version of the human that we're still stuck with is a very white Western version of that includes the traditional landscape aesthetic, a bit picturesque, a bit sublime, that we have on the lower left, cafe society, and on the right we have Florence, seat of the Renaissance for many, not to get into an argument about it, but the origins of modern capitalism as well. And we see something likewise of a kind of exasperated form in this imagery. I mean, certainly striking imagery, but at the same time, still populated with the kind of kitsch iconography of the outdoors, the sublime. So no matter, even if we go into space, we still take nature as an outside with us. One further image of this, which is the kind of contemporary version of the greened urban environment, such as we saw in the cities, the green city state of Singapore at the start of this talk. And the other figure, of course, who I would see in a very similar light, is that of Elon Musk. And let's not forget what's going on here is that we're looking at figures who largely evade taxation, which means they are largely evading even what mechanisms there are societally for socializing wealth to some degree. And as a kind of compensation for that, or their own version of what's going on, is that they somehow deserve to accumulate, have these vast amounts of wealth concentrated at their own disposal, because then they will become the kind of savior-like figures who, if we degrade the planet so much, we can go on to somewhere else and then reenact the same performance once over again, to tame, to colonize, to civilize. I think one of the ways in which there is an attempt to address this, the kind of tensions in the dialectic between nature and capital. Yeah, so I'll just remind us of that one more time, where capital has to draw everything into itself, but also from nature, make it instrumental to itself, but then also keep positing nature as being outside. One of the ways in which there's an attempt to resolve that, and this is going to bring us in a moment to something tangibly architectural, we're getting there, is that the technology at a certain stage of advancement then allows us to have a window back on nature. So it's the kind of the technology at a sophisticated level then just becomes a kind of background or frame for our access to nature. And this is an example. I could easily write a whole essay about, you might not want to read it, but what we're looking at here is again, it's something else that Bjarke Engel's group were involved in relation to the Hyperloop project. And it's the notion, I'll start playing it here, that these porthole-like windows, so we've got a view from inside a Hyperloop train, function as they go through the landscape somehow as a kind of real-world zoetrope. So when they reach the appropriate speed, as does a kind of spinning zoetrope device, the kind of precursor of cinema, then nature blends, or sorry, the window kind of starts to almost disappear, so that we have a more or less unobstructed view onto nature. Okay, so technology as a frame for an otherwise unadulterated natural environment. I think they're being rather fanciful with the speed this gets up to, given I think like the latest Virgin experiments, they got up to 100 miles an hour. We're now looking at 980 kilometers an hour. Anyway, there's a historical precedent for this, and there's an architectural precedent for this as well. And in some ways, to take us back to Tafuri's remarks about these two sides of certainly German modernist architecture, or architecture of the modern period. There's the expressionist, and then there's the eventually rational Neue-Sachlichkeit response. And that in this project from 1930s, or from Mies van der Rohe, the Resel House project, we hardly see any architecture. The architecture, the technology of it, has more or less disappeared, in the same way that the technology of the train, of high-speed transport, disappears, so as to offer us a more or less uninterrupted view of nature. There's an interesting book by Brandon Joseph, I think it's called Experimentations, and it's about the musician, the avant-garde musician John Cage, and how John Cage's most famous work, this 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, is in itself a kind of, it's not silence, it's just creating a kind of oral window frame onto whatever noise is actually happening in the space where the piece is performed. and Brandon Joseph looks in a really kind of interesting way at the way in which Cage was responding to certain ideas in modernist architecture. And I thought that this project by Mises is also exemplary of that. So the way that the most advanced forms of building technology allow us access through that technology onto nature. I'm going to say something here again about the Archit Engels group and Oceanics City, the project from last year. And what we see here is this eco-imaginary imagined as a kind of offshore archipelago-like condition in which some individuals are cast back into a state of nature. Yeah, so the problem of environmental crisis in this case, especially rising sea levels, is not addressed by stopping the sea levels rising, but by creating islands that float with that rise in sea levels and are thus unaffected by it. So the problem there is translated into one of reinserting the subject, the human subject, into its supposedly natural environment through the most advanced forms of technology and engineering. So it's a kind of project of reconnection and redemption in which individuals alone or gathered in small groups, notably never presented as a kind of collective unit or a mass unit, are figured enjoying the immediate sensory experience of what counts as nature. Renderings of sustainable futures, which the eco-imaginary of capitalism, or through which the eco-imaginary of capitalism projects visions of hope, are populated, as you can see here, by figures foraging and harvesting, engaging in simple forms of trade, taking respite from the sun under shades, engaging in kind of adventure, action, sports, kayaking. Kayaking is kind of ubiquitous in this sort of rendering. And I think that ecological crisis, being kind of too abstract to afford easy pictorial representation, too much the product, in other words, of complex interrelations and interactions, is seemingly beyond the means of individuals to comprehend or address. It becomes naturalized and kind of reworked into an infantile projection of ubiquitous greening of space for personal enjoyment. This is a long-standing feature of the architecture of Norman Foster. I would say high-tech. I know Norman Foster apparently does not like the term high-tech, but that's what I'm going to call it. Because I think it's interesting. So if we go back to these kind of examples, this is perhaps like the kind of earth form of this, that the building technology is there to allow you, or allow some, to look out on to nature as an aesthetic resource. So we see this is an older project, 1970s Wills Faber and Dumas headquarters in Ipswich in England, up to the more recent projects like the ring building at Apple Park. Again, this kind of harmonious blending of high technology, computational technology, ultimately, at least it's kind of planning, perhaps its manufacture, its managerial organization in nature. There's a deep history to this as well. There's a very interesting book by Luis Motzingo on pastoral landscapes, which I've been drawing on for some of these ideas. I don't think I'm going to play this for very long, but this is a more recent project, again by Foster's in Wales, which is kind of, to my eyes, kind of sickeningly pastoral, but presents us with this same, by now I think, kind of cliched conjunction of high-tech architectural capsule-like roof spans and the 21st century version of A Botanical Garden by Joseph Paxton. I would like, if I have time, to show you 2 or 3 minutes from a lecture by Norman Foster from a couple of years ago, which I think really tells us a lot about how the eco-imaginary of capital is both long-standing and at the same time unable to do anything apart from just repeat the tricks that it came up with in the 19th or at the latest early 20th century.
Cars are platooning and they're essentially nose to tail. They're like the train. And the train and probably the road and the cars merge into one. And what then happens? Does the countryside become the great kind of absorber of the gases that will make the dense city sustainable? Or does it lead to some of the dreams of Broadacre? If the infrastructure becomes invisible, autonomous, and mobility is pence or cents, and Ebenezer Howard suddenly seems radically new as the polycentric city. An interesting relationship there of that little segment is identical to Apple on its side. It's 17%, 83%, exactly the garden city of Ebenezer Howard. Does the gherkin really turn into a gherkin farm in its future life in the city? Does the Thames go into some wacky doodle sort of green with things whizzing through the air? Do we go to have a picnic in Battersea Park and the picnic table disappears with us below the ground and we pop up in San Francisco because of Hyperloop? And that San Francisco of today, our building in the background, lifted up to create a green space, will no longer perhaps be special because it's all green space.
What is the city of the future? A city that flies, covered and integrated, maybe an airborne city, or a city that walks. Yesterday's visions are closer than we think. Smart technologies will connect entire cities, changing how we live and work. Physical distance will cease to be an issue. Off-grid homes and businesses will generate, store, and distribute free energy for all. Physical infrastructure will become obsolete. More public space, inner city vertical farms, less trucks, less transport. Countryside will transform. Autonomous vehicles and Hyperloop reinvent public transport and logistics. Car parks, petrol stations, and garages disappear. Efficient use of existing roads and motorways create modern green belts. Green and self-sustaining polycentric cities at last could become a reality. Evolve and adapt our existing cities and design new ones that work in harmony with nature and our precious planet Earth.
I finish where I started.
Indeed. So I think we've seen a number of interesting things there. It's this kind of repetitive refrain of doing away with, large scale, presumably governmental infrastructure, or at least allowing infrastructure just to be a kind of background condition, so that we ultimately end up with a much more kind of individual centered notion of the experience of the city and the experience of our urban environment in more general terms. But I think what's striking there is Foster's rhetoric is that, at last we can achieve these dreams. But whose dreams were these in the first place? They're the dreams of the 60s counterculture, a largely white middle class Western movement. They're the dreams of a paternalist class of social improvers, which might be marginally better if we go back to Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City. And it's this, I would say, fetishistic notion of technology will solve these problems. And technology, by kind of falling into a background condition, will allow us to be close to nature, a very particular idea, a very pastoral idea of nature. The problem, in fact, for those suffering at the sharp end of the ongoing environmental crisis is not one of not being close enough to nature, but being too close to it, of being not protected and of not being able to protect themselves from its immediate effects, whether we're talking about flooding or we're talking about fire or the myriad other catastrophic effects of global climate change. And nothing that is presented in Foster's presentation, I would argue, would effectively address these conditions, because the responses and the eco-imaginary is focused on solutions for individuals in order to allow them to continue as individuals rather than collectively negotiated responses that do not have to be mediated through the requirement of profitability, that do not have to be mediated through the expansionist, accumulative, growth-based logic of capital. And faced with the impossibility at present, it seems, of escaping from those contradictions, and to return to a project such as this, the exasperated form of the eco-imaginary is one where it is only a very few, who will escape these conditions without trying to address them on their own islands. Everyone or every super entrepreneurial human subject living on their own island, literal or something like a pencil skyscraper towering above the rest, yet with views onto the pastoral version of nature. While the most primitive, so served here, as you can see, so served here by devices, by means of transport that are straight out of Broadacre City. Who makes these? Where are the factories for these? None of these can be included in these visions. The infrastructure would be real, but it's secluded, and instead, the inhabitant of this projected island retreat is treated to a sideshow performance of the most kind of primitive forms of engaging with the land, represented here by these figures, sowing and gathering crops from their immediate environment. And that's where I want to conclude the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I think we've seen very interesting analysis, and something that you do very well, that goes from the references in literature and how they can illuminate also the ways we are thinking architecture, and how those ways we are thinking architecture have also like social consequences. It sets social relations, and they're using architecture as the same as a very own instrument to build these narratives. And I was also very intrigued about your discussion about the individual, and how you build a rhetoric that is connected with capitalism. And was also really interesting your discussion about how the way architecture is being used, or is being using, how nature is being used, or architecture is using nature as a way to naturalize the social relations specific from a capitalist set, from a capitalism frameworking of living. We have some questions. I will pass to them later in a few minutes. But I think it's also interesting how that lecture you showed, he finished saying we finish where we start, and you also made these connections, how it's connected to the 18th century way of thinking too. I would like if you could talk a little bit. I'm gonna make the first provocation, then I pass to the other question. You by some point you said about the fetish and the fetish of nature, and I would like to know if you think that this fetish of nature, or the way nature is being used today in architecture, in social rhetoric, does it have the same pattern that once the fetish of commodity was approached by Marx? So I would like you to speak about a little bit more about fetish, and how does this fetish, in this case of nature, enters in the context of architecture.
So I try and be as careful as I can about using the word fetish, and perhaps I should still be more careful. I don't think that the fetish of nature is the same as the fetish of commodities, and nor do I think it's enough just to talk about nature being commodified. And that's why I was making that point at the start of the talk about how it's a kind of a superficial critique just to talk about greenwashing, or the kind of exploitation of nature. What I'm trying to say is that it's the nature as a kind of aesthetic resource is kind of produced in capitalism, that obviously all societies have a relationship with nature, or human societies have a relationship with nature. But capitalism has a very particular one, a very peculiar one, which, among other peculiarities, is its desire. It can't kind of own up to its own highly artificial relationship to nature. It always has to kind of present its idea of nature as if it has nothing to do with it, as if it's outside, while on the other hand, changing nature, putting that nature to its own work to an extent that no human society has ever approached historically. I think that in some sense, we approach something we could call a fetish, or at least a phantasmagoria, which is something that Marx speaks about in conjunction with the idea of a fetish. When we're looking at that image or that video of the Hyperloop train and the way it performs as a zoetrope, where its own technology eventually disappears and gives us a window out onto something. So it's the way it kind of stages the technology of capital in its most advanced form, stages its own disappearance and presents itself as something other than it is, that you might describe as a fetish, or at least as a phantasmagoria, because it's that kind of, also in the way that Walter Benjamin or Adorno talk about the phantasmagoria as it being about obscuring a kind of special effect that necessarily obscures the devices, the labor through which the special effect is produced, which is why I think that example of the zoetrope is a lovely example, but it's just the most kind of intense form, perhaps the most kind of exemplary, revealing form of a process that's much more widespread.
Thank you for the answer. It's very precise, and I think this idea of phantasmagoria is really interesting too. And I think it is a very nice sentence. It stages its own disappearance, and it's used in architecture as a kind of disguise and somehow. We have just lost here, but I found again. We have some Fernando Fernandes, who is watching from Rio. He made a very long series of questions.
Okay.
So I'm gonna make maybe a few before, and then we see how we go. We can come back to him later also. First question, he says, Le Corbusier conceived a vision of the cities based on pilotis, free basement space that were used afterward in Brazil and other cities, as well as cities around the world, but later was misunderstood and badly used. Do you think that one tried to bring some humanity and nature to urban environment? So do you think that us, or one could try to bring some humanity and nature to urban environment? And another question, he says, two very similar. I'm gonna ask the second one. Oh, the first one. Okay. The interdependent concept is largely widespread in some philosophical systems like Buddhism. I think you have some considerations maybe about Buddhism. For instance, why do you think the individually based societies have so much difficulties on understanding this interdependent concept?
Okay. So let's deal with the first question that you asked there. So I mean, all I would say to that is that Le Corbusier is interesting. In for many reasons, obviously, but not least in the context of what I'm talking about here, because he calls the work that he does in the 1920s a vertical garden city. So he's in that tradition of that Norman Foster is referring back to, of Ebenezer Howard's garden city and of trying to provide some synthesis between the most advanced at the time forms of industrial capital and a certain idea about nature and access to nature. I mean, perhaps this tells you also that things haven't changed greatly, because it's often, architectural students, watch out for this. Le Corbusier is often misrepresented as, bad modernism. It was all about concrete, but now we have to think more about nature and environment. Corbusier is an environmental architect in some sense. He, is in favour of having green roofs. The land displaced by the building is recovered on the roof. That through having those very large cruciform skyscrapers that appear in his Ville Radieuse, that means you can have a lot of space between them, which means you can have parks and green space and air and light. So yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that, but yeah, you can see Corbusier is working in that tradition. Another obvious point as well, I mean, I kind of use this reference to the Rezel house by Mies, but of course the Fenêtre en Longueur, it makes a kind of picture of the environment in which the building is situated for anyone looking from within, outside. I think to shift gears now and to talk about the individual versus interdependence, it's so difficult for us not to think of ourselves as primarily individual, because that's the way our society works. We have to perform that. We sell our labor as individuals. We don't sell our labor as a kind of common property. We are selling ourselves as individuals, and we buy things as individuals. So yeah, it's to do with the structural societal realities of capitalism as a system of economic exchange between supposedly free individuals that reinforces the idea that we are primarily and first and foremost individual. And then sometimes we have a kind of social interdependence subsequent to that, rather than it actually being the other way around.
Thank you. We have now a more straightforward question from Maria Carolina. She's asking, she's a student from the postgraduation program on Project and City, and she's asking, how can we think of architecture outside the paradigm of the individual?
It's actually probably a more difficult question than the previous two. How can you think of it? Well, I'm not going to give you the answer as to how to do that, but I think how can you think of that? You could only think of that with others. That this, a phrase I always feel uncomfortable with, and that architects like to use a lot, is the idea of the architectural imagination. So this notion that individual architects, because they are architects, can summon off, at the top of their heads, solutions to anything and everything that presents us as a problem societally, environmentally, or economically. And I just don't think that is the case. I think it perhaps makes you feel good as an architect to imagine that you can do that, but again, to be kind of embarrassingly orthodoxly Marxian here, it takes us back to his critique of utopian socialism, which, to give you a sort of hurried version of that, says his critique of that says, well, you can't just imagine out of the top of your own head an ideal of how you want to live. You have to look at what the actual historical and material conditions you're living in are, and what possibilities they present for social transformation. And then it's a step-by-step process. It's not just a matter of coming up with an idea and then just saying, oh, let's make it happen. It's in itself a much more dialectical process. So I think, sort of to return to the question and just try to give a much more concise version, I'd say that to think beyond an architecture of and for individuals, you would have to think with others, and the architect would have to have a more organic relationship with the people for whom and with whom they are designing.
Thank you. Made me remember also about one argument that we had once, a conversation, and you said a critique is also a form of practice. Yeah. So it's also a practice. And so to use the instruments of architecture to think and to critique what's happening, it's also a way of like raising understanding and conscious thinking about what's happening today. Maybe just to leave some question to other people too, I'm gonna jump to Louisa Dyer. Is there a difference in the way nature was absorbed by capitalism in the 18th century and today?
I think what I'm trying to say is that, and this is partly informed by reading, as so many people are today for obvious reasons, decolonial theory, is that there is a form and a pattern that's consistent. But obviously there's also a difference. It might be more intensified. So, for example, if you think about the basic processes through which capital, or agenda with which capitalism engages with nature, its logic is to produce value as an end in itself, and that's still the case, right? So that's what's historically more or less, if not absolutely unique about capitalism, as opposed to any other system. That it's not premised on simply maintaining a status quo. It's not premised on maintaining an existing social hierarchy, although that's something it does. It's premised on producing value as an end in itself. Therefore, nature is approached and appropriated in that fashion. But if you looked at examples like, I think it's kind of easy to get, and understandable to get, concerned and anxious about the manipulation of species. But I mean, that even predates capitalism. So like the domestication of animals, for example, but it's certainly more intensified in capital. So I think, yeah, there are different means now than in the 18th or 19th centuries. It's far more intensified to the point of it exhausting those resources, but the basic agenda has not changed, and the basic drive to colonize, tame, control, accumulate and exploit remains the essential driving force in the relationship between nature and capital.
Thank you. It's interesting also how it shows out in the techno-pastoral utopias that you told, that have the same elements, and also how people, maybe something like Jameson would say, like the utopias, sometimes they're like better for us to understand how we are imprisoned in the world, in the world we live. We have another question from Thales Lopes de Oliveira from the city of Anápolis, and he said, you used literature as a way to enter an architectural critique. Do you think the two disciplines are close in the way they create justifications for the fantasies of capitalism? And what is the role of critique to rethink architecture?
Right. Okay, that last one's a big question, but that's good. So let's stick with the first one. Yeah, I use literature. Personally, I don't use literature a great deal. I was referring more to Robinson Crusoe because Marx does. You know, I think we should be using painting. I actually kind of tend to use painting myself more, 19th century, 18th century painting, especially of landscape. Film as well now. But yeah, I think if we can look at architecture and as being like film or literature, as being, as you say, so kind of create justifications for the fantasies of capitalism. But I think that this is something that Frederick Jameson does, and in his own way does this fantastically well. But my concern with that as an approach is that we don't understand. This would be like a whole other subject, but we shouldn't just see architecture as distinct from literature as something which is just a representation of capitalism, but it is immediately a force for capitalism. You know, it organizes how we can or cannot relate to one another in certain ways. It directly, as a kind of investment in land, produces real estate value. So it's directly involved in producing capitalism. It's not something outside which is a representation of it. It might be that as well, but it's not just that. It's also, you know, immediately a force for capital, immediately an instrument of capital, because it plays a significant role in producing us as subjects. So that brings me to this timely issue of the second question, which is, what is the role of critique to rethink architecture? And I think that is it. I think there is possibly too much concern in the critique of architecture with taking architecture as only ideological, or as only representative of capital, or only representative of other forms of exploitation, inequality, domination, etc., and not enough to look at how it immediately performs. And so I can only say that my own understanding of the role of critique in relation to architecture is to constantly rethink the practice of critique, as well as rethinking what architecture does. So I don't think that critical theory as it existed gives us all the answers, or that Jameson and Guy Debord's notion of the spectacle are the last word, or perhaps even the most useful ways to understand the relationship between capital and architecture today.
Yeah. I guess there is this instrumental role of architecture, not only a representation. I think or also like an instrumental role of the representations that we build and how they created our subjectivities and place ourselves in the world. And we have other questions from Fernando Fernandes that was the first one. So we're gonna make together, because the last one. It's also like connected to the answer of the first. But this one was like about Buckminster Fuller ideas, as the geodesic houses, greenhouses, and so forth also contributed to a more realistic approach towards a more nature-integrated life. Isn't it? So he's wondering if Buckminster Fuller is also like a better way to integrate nature in life, and maybe a lot. And then about the answer of Le Corbusier, he thinks if you think that Le Corbusier tried to get close to some humanity. That's why he asked if you think that was a valid try forward or of a more integrated architecture.
Okay. So Buckminster Fuller, as Fernando probably knows, is a big inspiration for Norman Foster and for lots of like the architects as well that Norman Foster was talking about, like Archigram, I guess, as well. And this notion, so I think he's quite fundamental in this notion that technology advanced technology is a means for us to have a more harmonious relationship with nature. This question is useful to my own agenda because I think the point I perhaps haven't emphasized enough is that as architects focus on the purely architectural solutions to environmental crisis and focus on technology and advanced technology as a means to doing this, it's simultaneously a depoliticization of the issues, because it tells us that we can kind of rescue our world while maintaining capitalism as it is through better architecture, through technology. So Buckminster Fuller was, very explicit that, we didn't need politics anymore because we had technology. So we don't need left and right. We don't need to engage in those things because, cybernetics, for example, will calculate it all for us. And so in that way, and it's something I do write about a little in The Architecture of Neoliberalism, it feeds into a neoliberal ideology, which is ideologically the argument that we are beyond politics. So neoliberalism, I, like most people, would see as, in some ways, obviously right-wing, but it would present itself as kind of being beyond the political, because it is about the kind of technological, a technologically sophisticated way of addressing all problems through calculation. So, yeah, that was the question about Buckminster. That's my response to Buckminster Fuller. What was the other part of the question? Yeah, it was about Le Corbusier.
If he did some steps forward.
Yeah. Well, I'd say two kind of perhaps contradictory things that we have to keep in mind with someone like Le Corbusier or the whole reformist side of modernist architecture and modernist urbanism. is, I would, having said that the Garden City is a paternalist entrepreneurial project, of a kind of biopolitical project, I would, if I was in the 19th century and you said you can live in the Garden City or you can live in the slums of an industrial city, I would live in the Garden City. You know, would I like to live in a Le Corbusier high-rise in the 20s or 30s, or, you know, a house with poor sanitation and very little light? Yeah, I'd go for the Le Corbusier. So there is something to be said, or at least conceded, to that modernist reformist project. But I'm being asked if he didn't do something for humanity. But you have to remember with Le Corbusier as well, is he has a very particular version of what the human is. This takes me back to something I've been saying through the lecture, is that our notion of the human is very particular. And as I'm going to forget her name here, which is really bad, but there's a scholar who has been looking at the relationship, you know, Le Corbusier and eugenics, and he was very much taken with the idea of eugenics, so the kind of rational breeding of a certain version of the human. So yeah, we get I know those ideas were shared between left and right through the 19th and into the early 20th century. But nonetheless, I think there are also ideas would be kind of fairly appalled at here. And I'm just raising them because they underline this question of, well, what humanity are we talking about?
And there is also all the complex relations of Le Corbusier and the Vichy government also, and
Yes.
shows a little bit of his conceptions of society too.
Yeah.
But I have Fernando, thank you for the answer, and I would have also a question, because I noted here, but I lost in the middle of my notes, that is related about the literature question, which is also something that you use a lot in your courses and classes, which is the modern version of a novel, which is the series. And I also learned in your classes about Deadwood, the series, which is incredible, about capitalism and the demystification of the Pacific, conquest of the West, and also wired about like the political entanglements of the fight against drugs and etc. And I would like to know if you have some recent series that you could give a tip also.
Okay, yeah. I just want to say, and I've just looked this up just to give credit to this scholar, Fabiola Lopez Duran, who writes about Le Corbusier and his relationship to eugenics. Yeah, you're asking me what I've seen on TV recently. I've started watching a series on HBO Max, which is again Ridley Scott. Yeah, it's kind of obvious point of reference, I guess, but Raised by Wolves. I think that's quite interesting because it's certainly in the mise en scène, the setting, the costumes and everything. It's taken us into different territory from the kind of high-tech film noir cliches that we're all kind of used to, and we've got some kind of reversion to, we've got the most advanced technology, but combined with you know, a future scenario of religious cults, which kind of seems very present at the moment. I don't have any immediate insights into what it might tell us, or might tell us about architecture at the moment. But as I say, I also kind of give a shout out to Fred Sharman, whose work looking at sci-fi and the, you know, really in some ways the kind of minutiae of design details and what they might correspond to or tell us is really fascinating. But I think that, yeah, something that comes out for me in looking at across this range of examples and the way that Foster repeats them is the kind of poverty of the imagination. Yes, you have that. What would you imagine taking out into space? Oh, I'd imagine taking out a cafe society, or, you know, 15th century Florence. It's both kind of impoverished and kind of weirdly fascinating, and it's kind of yeah, I think it kind of speaks a lot about the way in which capitalism is just kind of stuck on repeat in terms of its image bank. I've lost your sound momentarily.
It was my fault. Thank you very much for your lecture and for this presentation, for this very deep and interesting reflection about how nature can be used in architecture, which it's also today everybody is sustainable, everybody it's about nature, but there is a politics behind it, and I think you did a great work in unveiling these relations to the way we live today. Would like to know if you have some final considerations you would like to share.
I don't think so. I mean, just to kind of take this as just me taking existing work. So some of these ideas are already in the essay Island Life, the Eco-Imaginário of Capitalism, which was published in Log last year, but I've just been trying to push them a bit further. And if I kind of just may suggest that to your students, that it's always a good idea to keep pushing and working at ideas, and just when you're satisfied with them is just like pull the rug out from your own feet and see if you can push those ideas further.
Nice. Thank you very much. Was great to have you here. I think we can be great to keep like in touch and sharing ideas and sharing commentaries. I would just like to share some news about the next lectures. So this is the program. Some 3 lectures are already in the YouTube. This lecture will also be available in the YouTube. And next week we're going to have 2 more lectures. One is going to be about regional design, a transformative approach to planning. So like mixing strategies of design in the dimension of the territory, from Valéria Língua, who has a thematic group on the eyes of on regional design. And in Friday, there is a discussion about landscape and design methods, about experimentations along rivers, so case studies and practices that Angeleta Vogueira has developed, also mixing design and plan. So that's it. Thank you very much for being with us. I would like also to thank the technicians, Renato, Wilder, and Katia, for all the help. We had some initial difficulties, but we managed to solve them. Also, the students that helped to organize this event, Maria Mello, Marília Rezende, Luisa Dyer, and Kairene. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon, and we keep discussing interesting ideas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.